Back in the 1970s, there was a young lady in her teens named Johnny, or Joni, but a woman, young woman in her teens, and she was at the lake with some friends, and she dove in from the pier into the lake, and it was much more shallow than she imagined, and she became a quadriplegic in about a second. And she would have drowned had not somebody been there and seen what was going on. Now, in the months that happened, of course, you can imagine that she was going through all kinds of questions about why. And God had put a young man in her life named Steve Estes that, amazingly, Mindy was good friends with. And a lot of you know Mindy's mom, Louise. Louise had kind of a ministry with Steve Estes, too, which was really cool. But Johnny said, now Johnny's known all over the world for her ministry to people who have all kinds of disabilities. The thing that sort of got her notoriety and got her name out there was she became a painter by having a paintbrush held by her teeth and began to paint all kinds of things. If you go on Google and Google some of her paintings, you'll be astounded. Anyway, as she was in her mid-teens and trying to figure this out, she said that Steve Estes gave her 10 words that shaped the rest of her life. And for some of you today, these 10 words may be your takeaway from this sermon. God allows what he hates to accomplish what he loves. Isn't that a great sentence? God allows what he hates to accomplish what he loves. God allows what he hates to accomplish what he loves. For Johnny, what that turned out to be as she looks back on those years was, and Steve told her, you are going to find through your disability the treasure of knowing God through Christ and of reflecting that to the people in your life. Now, as a mid-teenager, that probably doesn't really resonate that much. But, we're now about 45 years into this. And certainly that has been true. When I think about suffering, I think about the story of Johnny and that God is doing something beyond what we can particularly think of. When we go through times of suffering, it is a very confusing time, and it's confusing for different reasons. One reason is, especially when you're younger, you never imagine that you would be going through something like this, whatever the this is. It's hard to believe that this could happen to you, and here you are. Another reason why suffering can be confusing is that sometimes suffering comes into your life, barges into your life through some very unexpected places. Sometimes by people that love you and make just terrible choices that affect you and bring about suffering. And sometimes those choices bring a lot of heartache in the midst of your suffering. But I think the thing that's most confusing about suffering is that it seems to us as Christians that God could fix this situation, but apparently he's not. He's not going to. He may not fix this now or in the near future or some situations ever. Now, if you put all three of these things together at the same time, you are sitting in a mass of confusion. So when you go through times of suffering, I think the question that I think about is, well, what is our hope? What hope do we have? If we put our hope in solutions, we are going to find disappointment. If we put our hope in people, there are going to be times when we're disappointed. If we put our hope in God fixing our situation, there are times he will, and then other times where it appears he's not. So where do we put our hope? Well, I think ultimately, and this is shorthand, but I think ultimately what we put our hope is that through my suffering, I'm going to find God in a deeper way than I have before, and I'm going to have opportunities through this suffering to reflect him to the people in my life. That's my shorthand as I think about difficulties in my life. God is going to use this as an opportunity to find him at a deeper level and to reflect him to the people in my life. Now, this is This is illustrated in our chapter for today in John chapter 18 by Jesus as he goes through 5 different types of suffering. And astoundingly, all 5 of these types of suffering are all in about a 12-hour window. I mean, think about our lives when we go through one thing and then the shoe drops on another thing. Well, he's got 5 of these. And each represents a different kind of suffering that we go through. The first one is the suffering of unchanging circumstances. When you're going through life and you're praying and you're asking God to change and it doesn't. The second type of suffering is betrayal. When somebody close to you, somebody you love, does something that just seems to shatter that relationship, and you feel the awful sting of betrayal. The third is when other people make bad choices that make your life more difficult. This is a third kind of suffering. The fourth that he's going to go through is the suffering of being abandoned by those around him. And the fifth is unjust suffering. Now let's look at these. The first is the suffering of unchanging circumstances. And John chapter 18 begins, verse 1. When he had finished praying, Jesus left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley. On the other side, there was an olive grove, and he and his disciples went into it. And so the situation is they've just finished what we think of as the Lord's Supper or communion, and Judas leaves to go do his treachery, and Jesus and the other 11 disciples walk outside of the city walls of Jerusalem. And a few years ago, we got a chance to do that very thing that Jesus did here, walked out of the gates, down into the Kidron Valley, as John records here, and then up the other side into the Garden of Gethsemane. John just calls it an olive garden, and that's sort of a grove, and that's where he begins to pray. It's fascinating to me that of the symbolism that's in this story. Back in Genesis, there was the Garden of Eden, a place of immaculate beauty and splendor. And life began there for Adam and Eve. But also, the Garden of Eden became a garden of disobedience. And Adam and Eve were kicked out of the garden. And then we fast forward to this time here where Jesus is in a garden, but instead of it being the garden of disobedience, it becomes the garden for Jesus of obedience and submission to what God wants him to do. And then I think about that there's a garden to come. And it sort of reminds me of this picture. This is a picture from Bouchard Garden in Vancouver. We had a chance to be there a few years ago. And there's really no one picture that can sort of wrap itself around the beauty of this particular place. It's just a stunning beauty. But it reminds me of what's coming. There's a picture of delight and beauty and awe and wonder that's coming for God's people. Now, John does not record what Jesus prays in the Garden of Eden, but thankfully we have this in Matthew and Mark. Matthew 26:39 says, going a little farther, Jesus fell with his face to the ground and prayed. He'd asked Peter, James, and John to go with him to be what we would call prayer support. And so he's off, and as he starts to think about what he's getting ready to go through, torture, the arrest, and the crucifixion, as you or I might, this is a very human moment here. He is wrestling with this. He is struggling with it. He knows this is going to be terrible. And he's sort of what we would call, or I would think of verbally processing with himself as he's trying to walk through this, as well as praying. And the picture that Matthew gives is he falls down on the ground with his face to the ground. And he says, my Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will. Now, we just have a picture of a goblet or a cup here on the table. And the cup in Scripture represents different things. Sometimes the cup represents the cup of God's wrath. Now, our culture doesn't like a God of wrath. But our culture certainly does like it when justice prevails. The God of wrath, it all depends on what image comes to your mind. Can a good God be a God of wrath? You might ask the question, can a judge be a good judge and sentence somebody to the death penalty? The cup also, in this particular case, in addition, is the cup of suffering. And what Jesus knows he's about to happen is the cup of suffering and the cup of God's wrath is going to be poured out on him. And he is wrestling with this very thing. Am I going to go through this? And then he goes back and he sees Peter, James, and John, and instead of praying for them, they're all sleeping. Now, this is an assignment I could qualify for. If I had been there and Jesus, you needed somebody to go to sleep when they should have been praying, I'm your guy. I think I'd do that well. Ask Lance, ask Mark. They can give testimony to this. I can sleep anywhere, under any conditions, anytime, day or night. Exactly. A few minutes later, he goes back and prays the same thing. And in verse 42 of Matthew 26. And it's almost the identical prayer except for one difference. See if you can see what the difference is. He went away a second time and prayed, "My Father, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away unless I drink it, may your will be done." Anybody see the difference? There's one significant difference in that prayer. What? Not. The first question, the first prayer is, if it's possible, can you change this situation? When he goes back a second time, he realizes that the situation is not going to change. And so here he says, if it is not possible, it's a rhetorical question or statement, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away unless I drink it, may your will be done. So when I think about this particular kind of suffering, there are sufferings that we go through. And what is Jesus' response here? We see something of him submitting to the process of suffering, of a situation that's not going to change, and a willingness to, God, I want to honor you even if this situation doesn't change. And at the bottom of your handout, that's sort of our choice. Do we resubmit ourselves to God's larger story? Or, I think most of the time what we look for is some type of immediate relief, just to feel better about this situation. The second process of suffering, or second, is the suffering of betrayal. Chapter 18 of John, verse 2. Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place where Jesus was going because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas came to the grove, guiding the detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. Now, if you've ever seen a picture of the walls of Jerusalem, most of the time those pictures are during day, but try to imagine without all the lights that we have, at night here in Southern California that light up the sky, mostly darkness outside the city, outside the large city walls. And off in the distance, these guys, Jesus and the disciples, could see some lanterns and torches sort of snaking their way outside the city gate, down into the valley, and making their way up to where they are. I can imagine this would be a haunting scene. And as they get closer, you would see, the disciples and Jesus would see that there are soldiers involved with this. Verse 4, Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "I am he," Jesus said, and Judas the traitor was standing there with them. Now, again, this situation is sort of like seeing suffering coming at you in slow motion. The soldiers and Judas in the dark of night with their torches and swords coming at you, and you know it's going to get worse. And then you know that Judas is going to betray you. Now, I would want to run like crazy. Or I would want to argue. Or I might want to fight. Or I might want to throw a pity party and cry and plead for mercy. I'm pretty good at that. But what do you sense in Jesus' response here? Knowing that all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it you want?" There's something inside of him that stands out here to me. Jesus of Nazareth. They replied. I am he, Jesus said. Now, the thing that strikes me here is a picture of maturity, Christian maturity, that the only word I can think of that resonates with me here with Jesus is there's something solid inside of him. There's something solid that even in this harrowing situation almost seems like it's not moved. The wind is howling, but the tree is still standing. Almost that type of thing. And when I think of this, I often think that in my life it seems like when I'm in a situation, even that is somewhat even easier than this, I feel this quavering inside. Kind of this quivering. Sometimes this is fear or anxiety. And yet you don't get this at all in this situation where he is clearly outnumbered. Matthew 26:48 continues the story. The betrayer, Judas, had arranged a signal with them. The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him. Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, Greetings, Rabbi, and kissed him. Now, this is the typical Middle Eastern kiss that you still see, 2,000 years later in the Middle East. And the thing that strikes me here is the ability of human nature to rationalize almost anything. Judas had been with Jesus for 3.5 years. He knew what his mission was. And yet, at some level, it makes sense to Judas to sell Jesus out for 30 pieces of silver. But our human ability to rationalize almost anything doesn't end there. And what we have here is sort of another element of our human nature that is just awful. And that is sort of, how can I do what I want to do and get what I want, not just rationalizing it, but looking noble in the process. Looking like I'm the good guy in this situation. And here, this is what we have with the simple words, Greetings, Rabbi, teacher, in front of all of these, the leaders and the soldiers and the disciples that are still there, and to give him a kiss. Now, when I think about this, it's hard to imagine that something this awful could have been produced simply by human nature. Not that it couldn't, but I think this is one of these pictures of sort of the awfulness of hell or Satan. To be able to sell somebody that gave themselves to you for 3.5 years for silver, and in the process of doing it, being a traitor and doing something treacherous, you appear noble to those around you. Now, when I think about this, how does Jesus deal with this? You may have had some situations like that where somebody has done some awful betrayal to you. And what are you tempted to do in response? What are you tempted to say? This reminds me of the story of David in Psalm 35 when he was sort of in the same situation. It's Psalm 35, 11 to 14. It's in your handout. Where he said, Ruthless witnesses come forward. They question me on things I know nothing about. Yet when they were ill, or they repay me evil for evil and leave my soul forlorn. Yet when they were ill, I put on sackcloth and humbled myself. When my prayers returned to me unanswered, I went about mourning as though for my friend or brother. I bowed my head as though weeping for my mother. Now, David is going through all of this response to people that were his enemies. And that's what you have here sort of with Jesus. How is Jesus going to respond to Judas in this awful public display of devotion? Well, in John 26:50, Jesus replied, friend. Is that a word that would have come to your mind about somebody that betrayed you? Friend. And then he simply says, do what you came for. No lecture, no anger, no, Judas, what are you doing? Don't you understand this? There's none of that. I wonder what happened to Judas when Jesus uttered the word friend. because he knew he was not being a friend. Do what you came to do. And the question that I ask myself here is, when you feel that sense of betrayal, are you anchored and solid, or are you shattered? Now, we may feel shattered on the front end, but we don't have to stay shattered when it comes to betrayal. Well, unjust, uncertain circumstances that don't change, and betrayal. And number 3, others' bad choices. And here the imagery is of a sword. John 18:10, Simon, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Now, there are times in life when other people make choices that make your life harder. And that is certainly annoying, but sometimes it involves suffering. Now, Simon, we don't know what prompted Simon Peter to do this with Malchus. Perhaps he had seen the soldiers, and he was mad about that, and he saw what Judas did, and he knew Judas was a traitor. He knew that true. And it may be that Malchus had done something that also sort of infuriated and just had Peter snap, as we might call it. But of all things that Peter could do, notice which person he cut off somebody's ear. Look back at this verse. Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant. Now, in the next 12 hours, Jesus is going to endure 6 different trials. 3 of them are going to be Jewish trials, and by 2 different high priests. And one of those high priests, Peter, just lopped off that guy's servant's ear. Now, try to imagine if you had done something stupid and you had to go to court, and you looked up at the judge and you looked and went, "Oh no," because you had gotten mad at that judge's son or daughter and had keyed their car at night, and the judge knew about that. What would you think if you walked into the courtroom and saw you had that judge and he knew what you had done? Well, that's sort of the situation here. Now what strikes me about this is, how does Jesus respond to this situation where his life is made harder? And the thing that strikes me is, if you ask Jesus, did your life just get harder? I think he would say no. It doesn't seem to be any weightier now because of what Simon had done with the sword. Instead of being livid, or instead of giving him a lecture, verse 11 says, Peter, put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me? Shall I not drink the cup? And so I think here is, what is Jesus doing? What does this mean for us when somebody has made our life harder? How is he responding to that particular person? And rather than giving them a lecture, what is he doing? And the word restoring. He's trying to do something that restores Peter in his failure. Put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me? Now, Malchus is standing there bleeding on the right side of his head. Peter puts his sword away. Now, what does Jesus do with Malchus? If he was the servant of the high priest, and I was going to go before the high priest, I would think, man, I'm in big trouble. We don't know if Malchus did anything to foment this or response, but Jesus simply reaches down and he picks up the ear and he puts it on the right side of Malchus's head, and the ear works again. Again, something of a very different response than I would. Romans 12:19 says, do not take revenge, my friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, it is mine to avenge. I will repay, says the Lord. If your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink. For in do so you heap burning coals on his head. Now, it's not a statement about revenge. It's a statement about something about what Jesus is doing here. Or the principle is simply this: kindness when it's not deserved. You are offering kindness to somebody when it's not deserved. Is there an opportunity to reflect God's grace, or am I just going to get angry at the person who made my life harder? That's the question here. The fourth element is the suffering of abandonment. And in this situation, Jesus is arrested by the soldiers, and they take off with their torches and lanterns, and they make their way back down into the valley, the Kidron Valley, up the other side to the huge wall on the eastern side of Jerusalem. And they walk through that huge gate there. And there is somebody following in the shadows surreptitiously, and that is Peter. The other 10 disciples have headed for the hills like scared rats, except for Peter. He's following, watching, and he continues to watch in the shadows and follow all the way up until they get into the house of the high priest, where Jesus is going to be interrogated. And just outside that window, there's a courtyard, and there's a fire there. And he pulls up, trying to sort of keep himself covered up so nobody can recognize him while he can listen to what's going on. Now, Jesus had warned him about this very thing. And yet, Peter, instead of listening and heeding the warning, had argued with Jesus and proclaimed his own devotion, and he would never do something like that. In other words, Peter walked right into a very tempting situation where he was going to fail. One of the high priest's servants asked him a question. Weren't you one of those people that was with Jesus? And the first question that is given there to Peter, the answerer is asking a question that anticipates a negative answer. Oh, no, not me. You must have the wrong person. A little time passes, and somebody else asks the second question, and they ask it in the exact same way, expecting a negative answer, as if, no, weren't you one of those guys there? Maybe I got this wrong. No, you must be maybe a look-alike or something, not me. But the third time, and we have this in John 18:26, one of the high priest's servants. Malchus was a high priest servant. Here's another high priest servant. A relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off challenged him. Didn't I see you with him in the olive grove? This question in the Greek language doesn't expect a negative response. It expects a positive response. It is an accusation. Surely you are one of those that was with him, is the idea. And at this moment, verse 27, Peter denied it, and at that moment a rooster began to crow. Now, one of the other Gospels tells us that in this third response, Judas brought a curse upon himself. And it wasn't just that he cursed, using bad language, but it was sort of like, I'm telling the truth, and let my soul be damned if I'm lying. It's something along that line is what he did. And as soon as those words are uttered, the rooster crows. And suddenly Peter remembers that Jesus had told him he was going to deny him 3 times, and after he did the third time, that rooster was going to crow. And sure enough, he had denied Jesus 3 times, and the rooster crows. Now, at that moment, it appears to me that Peter just freezes. And he looks up at the window where he can see Jesus being interrogated, an open window. And Jesus looks at Peter at the moment the rooster crows. And they make eye contact. And at that point, it says Peter went out and wept bitterly. Now, for a long time, I thought, oh man, that must have been awful to make eye contact with Jesus after you just denied him 3 times, and he saw it, he knew it about you. He wept bitterly, and I thought, well, this sort of like that look must have been something of just an awful guilt trip. And the rooster crowing is kind of see, I told you. I warned you, and you didn't listen, and look what happened. You should have listened. That's sort of how I looked at this whole rooster crowing at the 3rd time. But then, think about that. Is that how Jesus deals with us? Is that how Jesus dealt with anybody in the New Testament? Okay, let's go back to square one. This time, remember, I hope you don't screw it up this time. There's no guilt trip that he deals with anybody on. So I'm thinking, well, what is it with the rooster? And what is it with the eye contact? And my mind went to the end of the warning that Jesus had given Peter, that after you've done this, after the rooster crows, I will restore you. I will restore you. So what did the rooster crowing mean to Peter? And Jesus looking at him at that moment, it's a word of hope. This does not take me by surprise, and it's really not going to be the ultimate point. It's not the ultimate chapter. Remember the promise I gave you. I can restore you even after this. And that's the issue here as I think about this. Are we going to stand on the promise of hope, or are we going to become cynical about ourselves? And then the last suffering is the suffering of injustice. Jesus is arrested. There are going to be 6 trials, 3 Jewish, 3 Roman. And the Jewish leaders for a number of years, a handful of years, had decided that Jesus needed to die. This was a terrible situation for him to live. The people might go towards him, and their jobs and all of Judaism might be undercut here. And they just saw this as a catastrophe and were looking for a way to kill him. We've seen that for a number of weeks as we've gone through the book of John. But because they were not the Roman government, the Jewish people had no authority to kill Jesus, to execute him. Only the Romans could do that. And so the Jewish leaders were trying to concoct a case in which they could take it to the Roman authorities, particularly Pontius Pilate, and say, this is why you should execute him. And what they came up with for this case was 3 things. That the nation was being subverted. He was leading the nation astray. The second part of the case was that he told the people not to pay taxes, which was a blatant lie. He had said the very opposite of that you needed to pay, you were obligated to pay taxes to Caesar. And the third thing is that he claimed to be a king, but they put this spin on it. And the spin on it was, if you allow him to be king, your job may be over, and Rome may come and sack you or maybe kill you. That was the inference here in what they say to Pilate. So then we come to Pilate, and he's interviewing Jesus, and John, in his gospel here in chapter 18, deals with this particular aspect. Pilate says to him, "Are you a king?" And it all depends on the definition of king. Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jews. But now my kingdom is from another place." Which it's interesting because if Jesus was going to overthrow the Roman government, you would need more than one sword that Peter had to do that, and more than 11 disciples. Pilate says, "So you are a king then?" Jesus says, "You are right in saying I am a king." And of course, the definition and the meaning of the word king is everything in this particular thing. "In fact, for this reason I was born, and for this reason I came into the world." The Bethlehem story was born, came into this world, the incarnation, to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me. Now, he was to become a king. And we know him as a king, and we are if you're one of his children, you are part of his kingdom. But it's not a kingdom that's going to conquer Rome someday. Pilate could have been able to go, "Oh, okay." Or the Jewish leaders might have been able to go, "Oh, okay, everything's still going to be like it is." But Jesus had much bigger target than that. He wants to conquer the world. The conqueror of Satan and the conqueror of our sin nature that lies within us. What strikes me here as he's talking to Pilate is speaking the truth in love, or just worried about defending myself. These are 5 different ways of suffering. Now, Peter writes a book later on called 1st and 2nd Peter, and he's talking to people who are Christians who are going through an awful time of persecution and suffering. And it's interesting to me that of all people that wrote these 2 letters, it was Peter, particularly what he had been through and by his failure. And in 1 Peter 2:20 and 21, it's such 2 remarkable verses. Not just in terms of how we're to deal with awful types of suffering, but remember that Peter wrote these after his experience that we've looked at, both with the sword, with Malchus, and with denying Christ 3 times. Chapter 2, verse 20 in 1 Peter. He says, "For what credit is it if when you do wrong and are beaten for it, you take it patiently? You know, you do something wrong, you pay the price. You know, there's no glory there. Nothing noble about that. But if when you do right and suffer for it patiently, how would you fill in the rest of that sentence? You have God's approval. Does that matter? It matters when you're in the midst of suffering. When you can't change a situation like you'd like to. You have God's approval. For to this you have been called. I don't think I want that kind of calling. Because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example you should follow in his steps. About a year ago, I wrote a poem that's in your handout. It looks like the date, March 16th, I just wrote it a few days ago. I think when I wrote this particular poem, there had been 33 deaths in America about COVID. Mostly, I think of in the Northwest, up in I think it was the Seattle area, at an old folks' home. So think about this. It's a year later. How fragile is what it's entitled. How fragile life may seem when something frightens us. A microscopic germ, this pernicious virus. There's peril in the air. Death strolls through this portal. Thus we are awakened. We are merely mortal. We love the illusion that we are in control. So shocked when the vile forces into our lives do roll. Is ultimate control the lie in which you hope? Uncertainty? Turmoil? Is fear how you will cope? Even in darkest nights, he redeems every fright. The wake-up calls of life can point our hearts aright. The providence of God brings good out of evil. In his sovereignty, rest in times of upheaval. Let's pray together. Father, it's a lot easier to talk about suffering than it is to go through suffering. And I sense that even now. And I pray that for the people that are listening to this, who are in the midst of suffering, that something in the story of Jesus would resonate with them, whether it's the suffering of unchanging circumstances, the suffering of betrayal, the suffering of other people's bad choices, the suffering of abandonment, or the suffering of injustice. Father, would you, as your people, allow us to dig deeper into our hearts and find the deeper desires there to want to find you and to know you more than we do today. And to use this suffering, however you choose, this cup that we are drinking, to reflect the wonder of you, that you are a good God and you are telling a good story. And by the time we get to the last chapter and the epilogue, we will see what your good hand has done. And the 10 words that Steve Estes told Johnny Erickson Tata will be proven true. God allows what he hates to accomplish what he loves.